truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please have a seat, sir.
Good morning, sir. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Brian Dalton. I'm a sergeant with the Knoxville Police Department.
How long have you been with the Knoxville Police Department?
I am in my 27th year.
And in what capacity are you currently employed as a sergeant with the Knoxville Police Department?
I'm a supervisor of the forensic unit, and my specialty is I'm a forensic firearm and tool mark examiner.
What does it mean to be a forensic firearm and tool mark identification examiner?
This is a multifaceted specialty. The majority of my work is microscopic examination of cartridge cases and projectiles as they relate to firearms. Also test fires of recovered firearms, comparison of those known test fires back to suspect evidence, firearms functionality, muzzle to target distance determination, shotgun pattern analysis, shooting incident reconstruction, serial number restoration, and it covers kind of the gamut of this specialty.
Can you outline for the jury your background, experience, and training that enables you to carry that particular title? And if you would, just go a little bit slower.
Yes, sir. I've been around firearms in the ballpark of about 40 plus years. I've been reloading for firearms in over 30 years. My training, as it revolves to this particular specialty, is designed around a 2-year training program that is accepted by AFTE, the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, as well as the ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Do you regularly engage in training periodically throughout the year for this particular title?
I do. My training was completed in 2018. The conclusion of that was a final comprehensive examination. Since 2018, I've attended the AFTE conferences. Those conferences host a number of individual training, include firearms armorers courses. I'm a certified armorer for Glock platform, Smith & Wesson M&P platform, High Point, Springfield XD series pistols, Springfield 1911, just to name a few.
What does it mean to be an armorer?
An armorer, the course is designed so that you can troubleshoot issues with a firearm, that you know the components of the firearm, as well as how that firearm functions and is designed to function.
Does that involve your taking these firearms apart and putting them back together?
It does. As an armorer, you're typically taking everything down to its full individual components and then reassembly.
Have you had occasion to testify as an expert in courts such as these in the past?
I have. In this particular specialty, I've testified 35 previous times and been qualified as an expert.
Your Honor, we would ask the court to recognize Sergeant Dalton as an expert in firearms and tool mark identification.
Any objection? No. All right, folks, the court will recognize Sergeant Dalton as an expert in the field of forensic firearms and tool mark examinations. Again, that means he is allowed to render his opinion. But also, again, just because he renders his opinion does not mean that you are bound to accept that opinion. Just like every other witness, it's your job to judge the weight and credibility to be given to his testimony. But he may render his opinion. You may continue.
Sergeant Dalton, if you would, I noticed that you brought a black bag with you. In the past, you've been able to educate the jury in the components of a cartridge, a bullet, and gun components. With the court's permission, I'd like Sergeant Dalton to engage in that exercise here for the purposes of educating the court, the jurors.
You may step down, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir, please.
So, Sergeant Dalton, while you're getting ready, the first part of your primer, if you would, I'd like you to discuss and explain with your exemplars the components of a bullet and cartridge.
In this case, we're talking about two particular calibers, one being a .45 gap. small, typical handgun caliber. It's in .45 caliber that is 0.45 inches in diameter. We're talking about the width of the bullet, it's a trapezoid bullet. As well as a 7.62 by 39, that's typically referred to as a caliber that's seen in the AK-47 platform and its variants, as well as the S2S and numerous others, but those are some of the most common. These are a little small to see, so when we talk about the components of the cartridge, use these larger demonstrative aids. Cartridge is 4 individual pieces. So we have the cartridge case itself, the primer that's inserted into the cartridge case, the projectile, as well as the powder that's inside. So those are our 4 components. When we're talking about the identification, I'm looking at where these individual pieces make contact with the firearm. So the head of the cartridge case makes contact with the bolt or the breech face. Firing pin touches the primer as well as the breech face. The extractor and the ejector also touch that area of the cartridge case body. There can be chamber marks that are placed on the cartridge case body by its interaction with the firearm. When we're referring to the projectile is pushed through the bore by the explosion of powder and that pressure. So the bore, the rifling of the bore will make contact with that projectile and can leave individual characteristics for identification purposes. So with those 2 pieces independent, that's all we're dealing with. Cartridge case, everywhere that it touches the firearm, as well as the projectile. And when I'm referring to rifling, we're talking about the inside of the bore. So those are lands and grooves that are cut into the bore in a rotating fashion, either right or left. There are numerous different types of rifling. So the widths of lands and grooves can vary, the number of lands and grooves can vary, as well as the direction of twist, left and right. Like a right-handed quarterback, as they throw a football, is going to spiral in a clockwise direction. The left-hand twist bore is going to spin that projectile left-hand twist, just like when you left-hand quarterback. So same principle. That rifling is there to stabilize the projectile to make it more accurate. So that's kind of a cutaway of the rifling. So the rifling has got, looking at it in this fashion, it's got a lean to it. So that's as it's going through the bore to give that spin to the projectile. When we're talking about class characteristics, getting into kind of the comparison portion of it, we're looking first in general to see if the class of the projectile is consistent across the evidence side. By class, I'm talking about bullet diameter, the type of rifling that's on it. Is it conventional rifling? Is it polygonal rifling? Does it have the same number of lanes and grooves? Do those look very similar? And we'll move to a microscopic examination for comparison purposes, looking for unique individual characteristics. Cartridge case is very much the same. Our cartridge case is the same caliber. Do they have the same shape of firing pin impression? Do they have the same shape of breech face aperture marks? Once those are consistent, then we'll move to a microscopic comparison. And we're looking to either identify, eliminate, potentially have an inconclusive finding, which means I can't identify or eliminate it. It could have been fired in a particular firearm. There's just not enough unique individual characteristics to make that identification.
Now, with regards to, now that you've covered the elements of the bullets and cartridges, can you go over with the jury the parts of the weapons that would be touching or involving your examination of those bullet and cartridge cases?
In this case, we're referring to a Glock firearm, so I've got the upper assembly of a Glock disassembled pistol. The areas that we're looking at is the chamber area of the firearm as it touches the cartridge case body. Primarily, when we're talking about the cartridge case, we're referring to the breech face, the firing pin, and those areas. So breech face is this flat area that the cartridge case is sitting against. And the rear portion of the firearm is where the striker or firing pin is. So that striker or firing pin will move forward through the breech face aperture and make contact with that primer. That generates the ignition of powder, creates a significant amount of pressure. Pressure expands the cartridge case into the chamber and locks it there momentarily. But at the same time, it pushes hard against the breech face. Most semi-auto pistols unlock in a fashion that the barrel drops ever so slightly as it starts the operation of expelling that fire cartridge case and picking up the new cartridge from the magazine. That vertical drop creates some shear. What I'm referring to there, think of my hands in the breech face. Cartridge case is sitting here, so that barrel starts to drop. So we get that vertical shear as it's touching the breech face and firing. All of those can create individual characteristics that we're looking at under the microscope. The other firearm that we're going to be referencing is an AR-15 platform. So to make it much simpler, this is a barrel from an AR-15. This is a bolt carrier group in an AR-15. So this is the bolt portion. Cartridge case is sitting here, like my finger would be, making contact with the bolt area. There's an extractor and ejector firing pin here. So we're looking at the same items for comparison. We're also looking at what's referred to as the barrel extension. This is a portion that's attached to the barrel that allows the bolt to lock in. And you see these lugs in both pieces, so those interlock, and that's what puts them together in the firing process as that pressure builds, goes down the board. So on the cartridge case, we're looking against this contact area, as well as when the cartridge is pushed from the magazine into the chamber, it makes contact with the barrel extension, as well as the chamber. So we're looking for unique marks that can happen as that cartridge is loaded from the chamber, from the magazine into the chamber, through the firing process, and ultimately ejected out of the firearm.
So when we're talking about the marks being made on the cartridge, those marks are being made with metal contacting metal. Can you explain that process?
Correct. My specialty is forensic firearm tool mark identification. So if we think of anything as being a tool, a pair of bolt cutters, pliers, anything like that, they go through a machining process. Bolt cutters are a very good example because you have basically an anvil or a wedge that's machined in a factory to opposing wedges. So there's a total of 6 potential surfaces that's made in a very hard substrate. So it's used against a chain, a lock hasp, whatever you're trying to cut with. That harder substrate, as it is pressed into the chain or the lock hasp, can transfer those individual machining characteristics from the original manufacturing to that softer substrate as it's being cut. The firearm in this case, or the individual components of the firearm, become our tool. They're made out of hard steel, something harder than the brass cartridge case, the nickel cartridge case, the copper jacket of the projectile. So all of those are the softer substrate. So you have those machining characteristics from the manufacturer of the extractor, the ejector, the breech face aperture, the firing pin, the barrel extension in this case. That's the harder substrate that can transfer those individual characteristics.
Is it fair to say that every Glock 45 gap pistol and the working components of every one manufactured will make the same marks on every cartridge?
They'll have the same class, but the individual characteristics aren't different. They're unique, very much like.
So you're able to then take a particular weapon and examine the particular working aspects of that weapon and compare them to the marks that are made on a spent cartridge.
Correct.
And you do that microscopically?
Correct.
And that's after you've compared classifications in what you've indicated earlier?
Correct. We're looking first, do they all have the same class? Do our suspect cartridge cases from the scene have the same class characteristics as our firearm? If the class is different, it's eliminated. If the class is the same, then we move into further detail for the example.
In this particular case, you were able to examine a number of 45 caliber gap cartridges, spent cartridges, and explain to the jury how you examined them with each other.
The first thing, these cartridge cases were brass body and also nickel body. Both the head stamp was marked as being the same caliber. They're all Spear 45 gap. So then the next thing to look for is, do they have the same class, further class? So we group them by caliber now. The next thing is we're looking for the shape of the firing pin, the shape of the firing pin aperture as it's transferred on the primer, or the shape of any other unique things that may stand out. But primarily by class here, we're referring to an elliptical firing pin impression and a very rectangular face aperture, and all of those show on the primer itself.
In that firing process, all the pressure builds up. The primer kind of act like a balloon. So fire pins come forward and create an indentation into the primer, but under that pressure, that primer is actually being pushed back into the breech face. Kind of a silly comparison, but if you think about an old plate of Fun Factory, you've got particular shapes that you put on that Fun Factory, and you put the Play-Doh in, you put pressure on it, and that shape comes out. This is kind of working the opposite direction, pushing that primer into the shape of that breech face aperture. So it's creating that rectangular mark because the breech face aperture is rectangular.
So in this particular case, you had an opportunity to examine all of the spent cartridge casings with each other.
Correct.
And your findings in relationship to having compared them to each other rendered what finding?
All of these bear the same class, moving to microscopic analysis. They all share the unique characteristics to identify all cartridge cases that were 45 gap as being fired out of the same unknown fire.
You also examined other spent cartridge casings that were not 45 gap, correct?
Yes.
And what were the results of those findings?
There were a number of 7.62 by 39 cartridge cases. There were Winchester brass cartridge cases as well as Wolf steel cartridge cases. We go through the same process. They're all the same caliber. Do they all bear the same class or same shape characteristics that we're looking at on the marks? Moving to the microscopic analysis, looking at the head stamp area, the primer area, and the cartridge case body, looking for unique individual characteristics sufficient enough for an identification, elimination, or the findings. In this case, all of the 762s in the scene were identified in the same number.
Now, you mentioned that there are other manufacturers of those particular types of cartridges. Does the manufacturer's name difference have any impact on your ability to compare them one with the other?
It does not. The manufacturers are basing their manufacturing, their design of the bullet and the cartridge cases based on SAMI specs. So that's a firearm industry standard for that particular caliber. The substrate of what they're making something out of, that can have a variation on how the marks look. So the nickel primer is slightly harder than the brass primer. The nickel cartridge case is harder than the brass cartridge case. Same thing with the steel cartridge case is harder than both the previous two. So it can impact how the individual characteristics look or the volume of individual characteristics. So we're talking about that harder eye.
So using your Play-Doh example, the different colors Play-Doh really doesn't matter. It's the material that's being pushed against.
Correct.
Now, with regards to, we've covered the casings and the bullets. How did you go about examining the bullet and bullet fragments that you were able to recover?
Okay. Moving to bullets, we treat those the same as the cartridge cases. First, we're looking, they appear to be the same general shape and manufacturing. They bear the same class characteristics, bullet diameter, rifle and type. Is it conventional? Is it polygonal? What's the number of lands and grooves? What's the width of the lands and grooves? Are all of those consistent? So we move those into smaller groups. Once we get those into smaller groups, then move to the microscopic comparison for identification purposes to see if we can identify this group of projectiles that we fired at the same time.
With regards to the 7.62, there was another AR weapon that was calibered in 5.56. Can you explain the difference to the jury in relationship to that?
Probably much simpler as a visual example. On your right is a 7.62 cartridge. On your left is 223 or 5.56 cartridge. When we're talking about those numbers, 5.56 or 223 is referring to the bullet diameter, so we're talking about the projectile level. So it's just shy of a quarter of an inch in diameter. The 7.62 is the metric version of that, and it's basically a 30 caliber. The projectile in those measure .311, .311 in diameter. They're basically the same length. They fall into will fit in a magazine capacity generally designed for an overall cartridge length of 2.6 inches.
With regards to the placing those particular bullets in a magazine. Can you explain to the jury how one might be able to fit into the other and vice versa or not?
So a little difference in, if we're looking at the cartridge case body of these. The 7.62, when you're right, it's got more of a taper. It's fatter at the head stamp area of the cartridge, and it's got a narrowing effect as we get into the bottleneck portion. So that taper has an impact on how this feeds. The magazine design for a 7.62 cartridge typically has a much more of a sweep to it, or more of a curve. The 5.56 can feed in a much straighter magazine. Maybe 20 gram capacity magazine for the air platform in 5.56 is relatively straight. You get into a 30 or a 40 cartridge capacity magazine, it's got a slight bend to it, but all that's based on the taper of the cartridge case. Both of these, because their length is very similar, will fit inside a magazine designed for the other. Because of the curve of that magazine, that may inhibit how they function through the magazine. May not function at all, may bind up, may function partially. That will just have an impact based on the magazine design. They're specifically designed based on the cartridge case taper.
Now, the size of the bullet contained in each of the cartridges that you covered, the 45, 5.56, and the 7.62. Can you explain to the jury the difference in the manner and size of those particular bullet components?
So again, talking about just general diameter, this is .223, .224, depending on what reference material that you're looking at as far as the diameter of the projectile. This will easily fit through the bore of the 30 caliber, .311. Both of these would easily fit through the bore of the 45 caliber, which is typically .452. The larger will fit through the bore of the smaller. You'll have an issue there. But we're talking about projectiles only. Then you need to start looking at the chamber. Will these actually fit in the chamber of a particular firearm? Will the gun close around that cartridge and potentially fire? The diameter at the neck area of the 7.62 is about 10 to 15 thousandths of an inch smaller than the top of the cartridge case body of the 223, just below the cartridge case neck. And the reason I'm referencing that is if you try to chamber this in a 7.62 chamber, this will stop slightly short. It won't allow the bolt to completely close unless you create so much pressure that you damage the cartridge case body itself, pushing it forward. This being a larger diameter than 7.62, and overall cartridge case size will not fit into the chamber that you
With regards to those two particular items, the 7.62 and the 5.56, those two items were recovered and you examined them?
Yes.
All right. So maybe if you can put your exemplars in your black bag, I'd like to hand you those two items and have you explain the difference in those two weapons. This is Exhibit 339. And so the jury's aware, before you came out, the judge had already cleared this. And this is Exhibit 352. And if you could, explain the difference in those particular two weapons.
We'll start with this one. The upper receiver on this particular firearm, and to simplify that, we'll refer to this as the barrel portion, and so that's the bronze piece that you're seeing. The bottom section is referred to as the lower receiver. With all of the components in it, it's a completed lower receiver. This has what's referred to as a pistol brace on it, so with the appropriate strap, this is easier to be able to fix the arm to fire it single-handedly. This particular firearm is chambered in 7.62 by 39. You've got reverse colors here. The bottom bronze portion of this one is a completed 80% lower receiver. So it was originally sold as a non-firearm, which had to be machined in a fashion to be able to complete it and add the appropriate parts to make it fireable. The receiver extension or buffer tube on this is a 6 position that is typically utilized with a collapsible stock. With the stock removed, the ATF considers this in a pistol configuration because it does not have a butt stock on it. This firearm was chambered in 5.56 or 2.4.
And is it possible to reverse the bottom portions of each and put them in the other weapon's upper portion?
Yes,
Can you describe for the jury how that works?
that would be simpler if I showed that.
Very good.
To take these firearms apart, bolt carrier needs to be forward, so as it cycles or the bolt carrier is locked to the rear, it's actually in this receiver extension portion. The spring is compressed, so to allow this assembly, you need to move that bolt carrier back to where it's sitting in the upper receiver or the barrel. Moving these pins out, these will separate. So we have those independent components. So completed upper receiver or barrel portion. Completed lower receiver, or we just call that the rear portion.
And before we get further into disassembling the other, which part of those two weapons is the part that actually makes the marks on the cartridges and the bullets?
Previously, I was showing you the barrel and bolt receiver. Excuse me, bolt carrier. This is the bolt carrier. It slides internally to the upper receiver, makes contact with the barrel. The barrel is actually underneath the handguard, so the locking area is approximately here where my fingers are at. So as that cartridge case is picked up off of the magazine, it is pushed by the face of the bolt, and it makes contact with the receiver extension, barrel extension, excuse me, and pushes that, guides it into the chamber area. So our cartridge makes contact with the bolt face, the barrel extension, and ultimately the barrel.
And all the markings takes place in that section of weapon, not the bottom section.
Correct.
We can go ahead and disassemble the other one.
Those are our disassembled components. It's just 2 pins that hold this together. Moving to the other lower receiver, we line up those 2 pins, hold in place, 2 pins, and everything cycling and functions as it is. The only difference between these 2 calibers, all the components are interchangeable between the two, with the exception of the barrel. The bolt face itself, the 223 is a smaller diameter, the 762 is a larger diameter, so the bolt face has to be the appropriate size for the cartridge case, and then the magazine. The magazine is designed to feed specifically that 762 with a much more significant curve in the back.
And you have, through your investigations, seen pictures of these two weapons in both configurations.
Yes, and what we mean by that, I've seen this firearm bronze barrel portion with bronze grip portion. I've seen bronze barrel portion with the black grip portion.
And we'll go through those pictures in a little while. But I wanted you to be able to demonstrate to the jury how those two parts are interchangeable. You can put them back together. I want to hand you what's been marked as Exhibit 341 and have you begin to explain what that particular firearm is and what you did to examine it.
This is a Glock model 37 chamber and 45 gap. 45 gap is Glock auto pistol, that's what gap stands for. That was a cartridge designed by Glock, and I believe it was in combination with either CCI or Spear for the original design of the cartridge. It is a shortened 45 ACP. The purpose of that was to create a platform that had a smaller grip, very similar in size to the 9mm and 40 Smith & Wesson, to make a firearm that was just easier for people with smaller hands to handle. That's just a little shorter cartridge. As far as the examination work, this is very much the same through all of the platforms. First off, we're looking to see if it is operable, safe. Does it have any significant modifications that would make it unsafe to fire? We will conduct known test fires. And so I'm using ammunition that I know where it came from, that is test fired through the firearm. The projectiles are recovered as well as the cartridge cases. Those cartridge cases are used for two different purposes. They'll go into an ATF database, which is referred to as NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. And the purpose of that is very much like EFIS is for fingerprints. We're looking to see if this firearm was used in some other event that we do not know about. Those cartridge cases and projectiles are also used for microscopic comparison. If we need to validate something that may be initiating a NIBIN or to compare against a case that the investigation is looking to.
So in this particular circumstance, you examined the spent .45 caliber gap cartridges with a test-fired cartridge that you fired out of this weapon.
Correct.
And did you do the same for the other ARs?
With all three platforms, yes, that was complete.
And we're going to get to your findings in a minute. Can you explain on the Glock 45 gap the components that would make up the identifiable marks on the cartridge?
Very much like the disassembled slide barrel that I had previously. By breech face, we're referring to this area inside here, it's just in front of the barrel, as this is in an open configuration. So we have breech face, the firing pin, the extractor, and the ejector, then the contact with the cartridge case with the chamber area, ultimately the projectile with the bullet.
Very good. You can put that back in the box. I think now, if it's okay with the court, we can have Sergeant Dalton return back to the witness stand.
Sure.
John, can we approach 1 second?
Sure.
I have 3 separate reports which I'd like to enter into evidence. I'm wondering what our next exhibit number is.
387.
.387, 388, and 389. rules.
Yes.
Sergeant Dalton, I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibits 387, 388, and 389. I'd ask that you look them over after you're done. Let me know whether or not you recognize what those are.
I do. These are reports that I prepared in regard to two different case numbers, as well as the cross comparison between those two cases and the recovered evidence and firearms. All of them bear my initials and my signature.
Do those three reports fairly and accurately represent the results of your testing of all of the items which we've been discussing?
They do.
Your Honor, we've moved into evidence exhibits 387, 388, and 389.
Any objection?
None.
Very well.
I'd like to go into some detail as to each of those particular reports, and starting with 387, which I believe is dated April 6, 2021. Can you outline for the jury what you did in order to render this particular report?
With all three of those reports, can you tell me which case number we're referring to on that?
Yes, it's KPD case number 21005353.
Okay. I received multiple firearms from this particular case number. These firearms, to my understanding, were subsequent to a search warrant and recovered. So these are the three firearms that we're talking about previously. So all of these came into my custody, so I completed verification of their functionality, completed test fires, and utilized those test fires for cross comparison and to input them into NIBIN.
So with regards to the April 6th report, you were examining the three different firearms and the cartridges and magazines that came from those particular items.
Correct.
And for the ease of the jury, you were looking to examine each of those particular items for whether or not they fired and what those particular items consisted of.
Correct.
So when you examined them, these particular reports resulted in what particular findings on April 6th?
So this is a documentation of their functionality, of my test fire, as well as a documentation of the magazines that were received with them and the ammunition that was received.
So the next report that you rendered was April 16th, 2021, and that is KPD report number 21-004897.
Correct.
Now, on that particular report, what was the reason or basis for you to examine these particular items?
These were items that were recovered from the initial crime scene, the initial shooting scene. These were a number of cartridge cases in different calibers, as well as projectiles. So the purpose of this examination is, as we have discussed, we're looking to see if we can narrow down a unknown firearm or connect to a known firearm that these cartridge cases and or projectiles could have been fired from.
And what were the conclusions that you reached in relationship to examining the cartridge casings and bullets that were found at the crime scenes in relationship to the weapons which were the subject of the search warrant?
First off, we'll deal with the crime scene. There were a number of 45 gap cartridge cases. All of those were ultimately identified to the recovered 45 gap Model 37 pistol that we have demonstrated. The 7.62 by 39 cartridge cases were all identified as having been fired in the upper receiver or barrel portion of that 7.62 AR-15 platform. There were a number of projectiles and/or fragments. There was a copper fragment that displayed polygonal rifling. Polygonal rifling is consistent with being used in Glock firearms, but it was a very small fragment. I was unable to determine caliber or anything past that, but just saying that the general rifling is a type of rifling that's used by Glock. There was a lead fragment that was recovered. The lead is the interior portion of most projectiles, so that doesn't make any contact with the bore or any other part of the firearm, so there's no identification made from that lead fragment. There were 3 .30 caliber projectiles. The .30 caliber is consistent with the projectile in the 7.62 by 39 cartridge. All of those displayed 4 right rifling, so they were all consistent in rifling patterns. 2 of the 3 bared significant damage, so I could not identify all 3 of those as being fired out of the same firearm. However, one of them was identified as being fired through the bore of this recovered 7.62 by 39 platform.
Explain to the jury why bullets and bullet fragments are more difficult to be able to pinpoint as having been fired from a particular weapon.
Numerous factors can come into play. If we compare those to cartridge cases usually have the direct contact with the firearm. If everything's functioning correctly as designed, they fire, they're expended out of the firearm, they hit the ground, they may bounce, they may roll, it could be stepped on, there could be other damage that occurs after that. But typically it's not significant. If we're referring to projectiles, the projectiles are accelerated through the bore at extremely high pressure, high velocity, then they make contact most often with some substrate that can be hard or soft tissue, can be metal, construction components, just depends on what they're fired through. So they're hitting some other hard substrate at a high velocity. So that can cause damage to the projectiles, it can cause them to come apart. All of that can impact the individual characteristics that we're looking for.
Having a bullet strike the back of a motor vehicle, going through that motor vehicle, its seat, and a particular victim, and having ultimately be lodged into the front section of that vehicle, would that be an example of having the bullet being so deformed that you couldn't make any identification?
Yes, all of those are contact points that can create damage to the projectile or take away from those individual characteristics that we're looking at.
After that report, there was a third report dated April 28th, 2021, in which there was an additional comparison of the .45 caliber gap spent cartridges found from the recovered vehicle, and it was taken from the Fifth Avenue impound. Did you examine those 2 additional cartridge cases and the bullet found in the blue Honda?
I would. That recovery location was actually at our Fifth Avenue forensic bay. Those 2 cartridge cases were .45 gap in caliber, and they were ultimately identified as being fired out of this recovered .45 gap pistol.
So those 2, together with the other 9 that were recovered at the crime scene, you rendered an opinion as to whether or not they were all fired out of the same weapon.
That is correct. They all were.
And that weapon was the .45 caliber gap Glock pistol that was recovered from the defendant's residence.
That is correct.
And just remind us, in terms of the capacity of the magazine of the .45 gap Glock pistol, what is the magazine capacity and the capacity total overall of that weapon?
Okay, bear with me, look back at my notes because we dealt with a number of firearms in this case. The marked magazine capacity and the verified capacity on that Glock is 10 cartridges.
And with that capacity of 10 in the magazine, is that particular weapon actually able to be fed up with 1 in the barrel plus 10 in the magazine?
It is. We refer to that as 10 plus 1. So what we're saying is the magazine is fully loaded and there is a cartridge chambered in the firearm.
So we have 11 spent cartridge casings, all 11 being matched to the Glock .45 gap pistol that was found at the residence of the defendants.
That is correct.
And the .7.62 cartridges, the results in your evaluation of those, are those cartridge casings able to be matched with the 7.62 firearm that was also found at the defendant's residence?
Yes, they were. They're identified as being fired through that particular AR-15 barrel upper receiver.
Okay. Next, I'd like to cover with you your having viewed photographs and videos of these particular weapons before and after the event that we are discussing. And I believe that what we've done is presented them in a PowerPoint. But prior to this, you've had an opportunity to look at these videos and still photographs, correct?
Yes.
And as a result of examining those photographs and videos, you have reached some conclusions as to the firearms contained in those videos and photographs are related to those firearms which we have presented in evidence in this case.
They are. In one of the particular images, there's enough unique characteristics that I believe that's the same lower receiver that we have in evidence. And the characteristics are relatively unique, so that we can say that throughout the majority of these images and videos that they are very consistent with what we're observing in the videos and the images.
And in regards to the .45 caliber Glock Gap handgun, there is something at the front end of the barrel that is of some significance. Isn't that true?
There is. There's a red laser that's an aftermarket attachment. This is probably a good time to also point out the sights on this particular Glock are not original Glock sights. The Glock sights are typically a little more squared. This has got a little more of a ramp to it, so that's something else that looks a little more unique with this particular firearm. This laser sight that is attached is black on the left-hand side, and then it has, I believe it's a kind of a yellowish sticker or some other identifier on the right side of that particular laser.
And in your reviewing these videos and still photographs, were you able to identify that particular unique item on that .45 caliber Glock Gap pistol as being that pistol which is recovered from the defendant's residence and has been placed into evidence today?
Yes, what I'm seeing on the images and the videos, everything is consistent between the recovered firearm and those images and videos.
And one other thing that I wanted to point out that I don't think we covered, in regards to the 7.62 Exhibit 339, what, if anything, do you have to comment with regards to this particular sticker that's located on the upper receiver of this particular weapon?
It's, I won't say it's completely abnormal, but the sticker is not something that we would see or any other type of sticker in a regular routine casework. This sticker stands out, and we use that in relation to the pictures and videos based on the relationship of the location of that sticker into the upper receiver, and it also overhangs what we refer to as the bolt catch. So that bolt catch paddle kind of gives us an orientation or location of that sticker within this particular firearm.
In your examination of the videos and photographs, you draw reference to that particular geographic location of the item that you're referring to.
I do.
In relationship to the sticker that's applied.
I do.
And is that yet another way in which you can tie those photographs and the videos to this particular weapon?
Yes, it shows more consistency.
Have you reviewed them? Okay. We have developed a hard copy of the PowerPoint slides for Sergeant Dalton to review, and we're up to 390. May I approach? I'll show you what's been marked as Exhibit 390. Could you just review those and let us know what that compilation of slides represents?
These all appear to be still shots or still shots from the videos that I have previously reviewed.
Your Honor, we would offer Exhibit 390.
Any objection?
Yes, may we approach?
Yes.
May we publish? Looking at this first slide of the exhibit, are you able to identify the weapon that is depicted in that particular picture?
Yes, this is consistent with the bronze lower receiver or pistol portion and the bronze 7.62 upper receiver or barrel portion that we have referred to earlier.
The next one?
Before you do that, can you, just for the record, tell us how that file, what's the file identification on that? Sorry. Like, how are you identifying this? What's the file name on that?
Yeah. This particular slide has been marked for ID only. That is file name CM-chat-media-video-ZXIMK lowercase n, lowercase l, capital P, lowercase d, capital O, E, P, numeral 6, lowercase z, b, 3, capital N, 0, small case t, I, capital G, dot, M-O-B.
In the future, I'll only have you do the last 4 digits. All right, you may move on.
In the next particular slide, in this particular slide, the last 4 numerals are 0195.MP4. Are you able to identify the weapon that's shown in that video?
Yes, that's consistent with the same firearm from the previous video, as well as the bronze barrel portion and bronze pistol portion that we've looked at earlier.
And the next? Are you able to identify that weapon that's contained in that video?
Yes, but at this time, the barrel area and the pistol portion have been, or pistol grip portion, have been flipped as we did here. So you've got the bronze 7.62 on top of the black Tennessee Arms pistol grip.
And for the record, that is 0205.MP4.
0250.
It would be
025.
also worth noting, this image shows that significant curvature of the magazine that we've talked about before. I think this is the first image that shows that in good detail for you to understand what we're referring to.
And the next video. There are 2 particular weapons that are noteworthy. Are you able to identify them in this video?
Yes, the front seat, we're referring to that bronze 7.62. In the, what I think is the driver, the videos I believe are flipped, is a black handgun with a red laser. And when we get that muzzle view of it, that shape of the muzzle is very squared off and rectangular, which is consistent with the manufacture and shape of a Glock.
And the red laser.
And the red laser.
And that is item 0654.mp4. And the next video.
He just bought a black and he didn't ID him. He didn't ID him. Come to Chevron and get his.
Were you able to identify a weapon in that particular video?
I went through this video and tried to grab it as much as I could frame by frame. What we see pronounced in the video is that collapsible buffer assembly that is consistent with what's on the bronze pistol grip portion that we see. So it looks like it's stuffed down in between the center console and the seat, but we see that buffer tube assembly that is consistent with the recovered evidence item and that bronze lower receiver or pistol grip area.
And that particular video is entitled Artifact Information. And the next slide, I think, are photos. Are you able to identify what's located in that particular photograph?
Okay, this dividing line is the separation between the upper and lower receiver. This is the sticker that we were discussing earlier. This is our bolt catch that is affixed to the lower receiver. There's actually a pin that goes through this pronounced area. What stands out here is the location of this E in relation to that bolt catch. There is a light area in the finish on the lower receiver. There's a dark area here. There's a lighter area here. And it's very difficult to see, but there is a linear mark just above the magazine catch, and that is all of those individual locations are notated in the lower receiver that we recovered, the pistol grip bronze lower, as well as the sticker area on that 7.62 upper. All are consistent with the recovered firearms.
And this is under user item, last four digits, C as in Charlie, 172.
Yeah, I think it's the entry ID, so that'd be 473A.
The entry ID, the last four digits are 473A as in alpha. And the next item?
There again is our dividing line between the barrel portion and the pistol grip portion. So note the relationship of that sticker. Even though we're dealing with a different pistol grip portion or different lower receiver, that sticker is still in the same relationship with that bolt catch. And this says Tennessee, so this is consistent with the lower pistol grip portion that we have. It's just what we recovered is a Tennessee Arms lower receiver.
And the entry ID on that is B as in Bravo, 1BB. And the next item. What is significant in that particular picture?
You can see the significant curvature of the magazine. You can see the bronze kind of an outline around the magazine. That's the magazine well. So we're dealing with the consistent coloration of the bronze pistol grip area that we have. The very short forend and the way the forend is cut, the perforations in the forend, as well as the muzzle device, all of those are consistent with our recovered firearms.
May I approach with Exhibit 381B, which has already been entered into evidence?
Yes.
Oh, this is for ID. What does 381B represent?
This is a still image of the image that we're seeing on the screen.
And the next item. What are significant in relationship to the weapons that are displayed in this particular photograph?
Okay. Very difficult to tell, but the shape of the muzzle direction view of the forend, or also referred to as the handguard on the 7.62 upper, the shape of the muzzle device is consistent here. And what I see is the rectangular shape of the slide and the very squared off nose of the slide area of this black handgun is consistent with a Glock.
Are you able to identify the laser underneath the barrel?
At that angle, I can't tell you that it's a laser, but there's something that appears to be attached underneath.
I have Exhibit 381. May I approach the witness with Exhibit 381A marked for identification?
Yes.
381A,
It's a representation of what we're seeing on the screen.
and it's easier to look at that than it is the screen.
It is clearer, yes.
And the next item. What is significant in relationship to what is depicted in that photograph concerning the weapons?
Several more things stand out in this photograph. The significant curvature of the magazine. Looks like we're seeing the hand is covering up the mag well, so we're not able to pick out the coloration of that pistol grip portion. But the upper is that bronze, very short with the muzzle device, all consistent with the 7.62 that we have shown earlier. The handgun is consistent in shape with the recovered Glock firearm, and what really stands out is that yellow identification. I believe it's a sticker that's on the side of the laser.
And I have Exhibit 381 marked for ID only. May I approach?
You may.
381 for ID.
A representation of what we're looking at on the screen.
And the next photograph. What, if anything, in that photograph is remarkable in relationship to weapons that we've been talking
Okay.
about?
Right here, I can't tell if this is shoved in a pocket or in the waistband. It looks more like it's in the waistband. The grip angle, the color, and just the general shape of the back end of the slide area is consistent with what I would expect in a Glock firearm.
Very well.
Sorry. That is file number 0204.HEIC. And the last item, what is significant in relationship to what is depicted concerning the weapons that we've been discussing?
Okay, very pronounced is a red laser that's on, but what shows up very well is the unique shape, the very square angles that we observe on a Glock, as well as when you look at the front of the Glock, you've got the square top, the square sides, but there is a semicircle underneath. That's where the guide rod locks into place, and that stands out very pronounced here. So it is consistent with the Glock firearm.
And that is file 0216.HEIC. Yep. May I approach the witness with that?
Yes.
been marked as Exhibit 309. I'd like you to, if you could, narrate what is depicted in that particular map.
Well, this is an overview of what I've been told was the crime scene. I did not respond to this particular crime scene, but of note, of things that I have examined, is the firearm here at the top. This is the bronze barrel portion with the black pistol grip portion with the significant curvature. This
Let me
is
stop you there. I think because we have jurors way in the back, with your Honor's permission, could we stand in the...
Actually, I'm going to object. This is for identification only at this point. It's being published to the jury as proper about it.
Yeah, it's not moved into evidence, but he can still comment on it if it, I assume what you're trying to do is get him to identify these particular casings as the ones he, yeah, if he can do that, if he knows from this, then he can. But I don't think they're trying to move in the item, the map. Sit down. Are you familiar with what those casings are, Sergeant Dalton?
not the locations. My exhibit numbers are going to be different than what the evidence marker numbers utilized here are. So without that cross-reference, I don't have, we do have the legend on the bottom. So what I can give you is the .45 caliber here notated in green, 45 gap are notated here also in green. The purple circles are the 7.62 by 39, and those are in this area.
And the others that you also examined?
I did. There were 9mm cartridge cases. Those are denoted by the kind of the reddish color, pink. They are linearly down the street, mostly along one side, one's on the opposite side. There was a single 380 cartridge case. Based on my examination, it had significant damage to it, so it looks like it had been exposed to the elements for quite some time and had either been stepped on, run over, some other type of significant damage to that cartridge case.
In relationship to the 9mm cartridges that you examined, were you able to reach a conclusion as to whether or not those, along with the 380, had anything to do with this particular event?
The 9mm were all identified as being fired out of the same unknown firearm. The 380, there's nothing else to compare that to, so it's just an individual component by itself.
Yes, I think so.
309, it's a map. With some markings on
Maybe not published.
it. You may publish.
Sergeant Dalton, if you could you come down and do a best to get out of your way so that you can, I'll hold it and you can come towards me so.
As we were talking about before, with the legend produced down here at the bottom, these green circles reference the 45 gap cartridge cases shown in the middle of the street. The purple references the 7.60 by 39, kind of diagonally across the street. The kind of the pinkish color references the 9mm. They're linear down the street, further away from the first two batches, and one across the other side of the street. The single 380 is all the way back at the intersection. The two firearms that we've been discussing, the 7.62 on the black pistol grip portion is referenced at the top, significant curvature of the magazine, and the Glock 37 and 45 gap will reference that.
Just to be clear, Sergeant Dalton, you're not the one that found those shell casings in those locations. You're just the one that tested them and matched them to those weapons, right?
Correct.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, Sergeant Dalton. Pass the witness.
Cross-examination, who'd like to go first? All right, Ms. Robinette, you can go.
Dalton, how are you doing? Sergeant
sir.
Dalton, I'm sorry. I apologize. How are you doing today?
I'm very good.
My name is Roy Robinette. We met before. And the casing that you just referenced, the 7.62 and the 45 gaps, you were not there to collect the casings, correct?
Correct.
And you don't know how long that casings had been there, am I right?
Correct.
Okay. It could have been there 2 days or 1 day before. Am I right?
Correct.
Or 3 weeks?
I can't say that. I mean, we could look at all sorts of dynamics. If it had rained the night before, if it had snowed, maybe some of that debris would be inside the cartridge cases. So based on specific details of that crime scene, maybe you could isolate a narrower window.
Okay. But in this case, there was no analysis was done.
I was not on this scene.
Okay. And you did reference in your report KPD 21-004897. You were provided with a bullet from the blue Honda Accord, is that correct?
I believe there were multiple items from the blue Honda Accord.
But the one particular full bullet, is that?
Yes, there was one that was more intact than the other two.
And you tested that bullet, and you stated on your finding that the bullet could have been fired from several firearms, is that correct?
We're looking at two different portions of this analysis. So when I'm dealing with a single or a group of unknown projectiles, we're going to group those based on class, as we've discussed before, class characteristics of the rifling and the caliber. If we don't have a firearm, there is an FBI database that I can put the specific GRC, or general rifling characteristics, into. So that consists of the caliber, the number of lands and grooves, the rotation or the right hand or left hand twist, as well as measurements taking off of the width of the lands and grooves. So if we have a projectile only, I can plug that information into the database, and it can give me a list of potential candidates, not completely inclusive. The database, because there's so many firearms out there and variations where barrels can be changed between things, as we have shown here. So it gives you a direction in the investigation of firearms you may be looking for.
So my question is that in your report, you state that this particular bullet may have been fired from some of these listed firearms, but it's not in an exhaustive list. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that changes when we compare to a specific firearm.
Okay. And you listed the China Type 56 SKS as one of them? Is
I
that
did.
right? You listed the Russia SKS, is that right?
I did.
You list the Polytech AKS 762?
I did.
You listed the Russia AK-47?
I did.
You list the Romania FPK?
I did.
You list the Roarm SAR-1?
I did.
Now, this is not an all-inclusive list, correct?
That's correct.
And none of these firearms were collected in this case?
Not that I'm aware of.
Now, you also testified that the pictures that you saw of Mr. Jordan holding a certain firearms, you testified that it was consistent with the firearms that was introduced today.
Correct. All of those images, I would say, are consistent with what we recovered, with the exception of the single image that had the light and dark areas specifically in the finish, as well as the linear striation above the magazine. Those are very, very unique, and also the location of the sticker is very unique in the barrel portion.
When you say consistent, you're not 100% sure that it is, am I right?
I'm not making an identification, correct?
Okay. And you did discuss a little bit about the material of the casing. For the 45, in your report, you indicate there was a brass body and a nickel body. Is that correct?
That is correct. Both were manufactured, or the head stamp is Spear 45 gap. So I know Spear to make ammunition both with nickel and brass cartridge case bodies.
So between the, I'm sorry, did you finish? I apologize. Between the brass and the nickel, is the nickel more sturdy than the brass?
Well, we've got to look at two things here. We're not just focusing on the cartridge case body alone for an identification. We're also focusing on the primer. And if I believe both of these had nickel primers, I'd have to reference my notes.
Oh, well, the question I'm asking is nickel is stronger than brass?
The nickel is actually an overlay typically over a brass cartridge case. I would have to cut into these cartridge cases to tell you the underlying substrate. So nickel is a finish, and typically it is slightly harder.
Okay. Well, how about this? Will you agree with me that the materials that the bullet or the casing makes might affect some of the characteristic that you were talking about?
No.
No? So if one material is weaker than the other, would the weaker material have a more impact when it's fired from the same firearm?
First off, we're sorting again by class. Then we're looking for sufficient individual characteristics. Just because one's harder or softer doesn't mean that it may not bear the same individual characteristics. That would be on a case-by-case basis. It would be based on the firearm. There's a lot of things that could come into play there. But in this case, they all bear the same areas of unique individual characteristics sufficient for an identification.
And Your Honor, may I retrieve the 45? Sure.
There we go. All right, good.
Sergeant Dawn, this is the firearm that was collected from the resident. Now, this right here is considered an attachment, correct?
It is an accessory, yes, it's on the Picatinny rail.
Okay, and this is called a laser?
That one is a laser. There's flashlights, there are laser light combinations. This case, it's a laser.
And this attachment laser can be removed from this firearm, correct?
Depending on how it's attached, how tightly it's attached, whether a tool may be required. So yes, it can be removed, maybe by hand, maybe you need a tool.
But the question is, it can be removed?
Yes.
With a tool or by hand, correct?
Yes.
And this attachment, can it fit in other Glock member family?
Yes.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Ms. Mathis?
Yes, Your Honor. Good
Afternoon now, Mr. Dalton, Sergeant Dalton. Ashley Mathis, I represent DeAndre Davis. So going back sort of to the beginning when we were talking about sort of the first examination you did on April 6th in this case was just an examination of the operational firearms and just sort of what they were, correct?
Correct. Well, the operation, test fire, subsequent acquisition and denial.
And you were given a model Glock 37, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that that's a fairly popular firearm, correct?
No.
So would you agree with me that in 2003, about 2003 is when the Glock 37 was released?
If you say so, I don't know release date.
Okay. Are you an expert in Glock firearms specifically? I know you said you were an armorer.
I'm an armorer for all of Glock, with the exception of the Model 18, which is their select fire handgun.
Okay. So are you aware that it was originally designed to compete with the 1911?
Not with the 1911. It was designed to compete with the 45 ACP cartridge. The 45 ACP cartridge is approximately 2/10 of an inch longer. The purpose for the Glock idea behind this was to make a firearm compatible with the muzzle velocity, muzzle energy in the 45 ACP in a slightly smaller platform so they could produce a smaller handgun, smaller grip. So basically the same grip diameter, grip dimensions of a 9mm and 40 Smith & Wesson.
And you would agree that Glocks are extremely popular firearms?
Yes.
Okay. And you were also given some ammunition to inspect that was Spear brand?
Correct.
And that's a fairly common brand of ammunition, correct?
Spear is a large manufacturer.
And you were also given some Winchester magazines to inspect, or cartridges to inspect, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And that's fairly common as well, correct?
Yes.
You can buy it at Walmart.
I would assume so.
Okay. And you would also agree that Wolf manufactured cartridges are very common?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a very popular style of firearm and very common ammunition, correct?
No.
You would not agree that a Glock 37 is a popular firearm?
No.
Okay. So
Would
when
you like me to elaborate?
Excuse me?
Would you like me to elaborate?
You may, if you wish.
The 45 gap, as it was introduced, and I'm going to go off of your early 2000 date, that was prior to approximately 2008, there started to become a little bit of an ammunition shortage. 45 gap was not such a popular cartridge. It was just taking off based on the timeline. So ammunition manufacturers directed toward calibers that were much more marketable. So the 45 gap may have done well, but ultimately I believe that it was not as popular because the ammunition manufacturers started to cut back production in that particular caliber. If I compare the 45 gap to other items that come through my unit based on evidentiary submissions, I cannot think of any other 45 gap that has come through. I'm not saying there hasn't been one, but in the past 5 years, I don't recall another 45 gap that's come through. So it is much less common than the 9mm, the 380, the 45 auto, the 40 Smith & Wesson, some of the rifle calibers that we see. So yes, the ammunition manufacturer is a common name. 45 is a common caliber that we see, 45 auto, but 45 gap I see much less, so it is not as common.
But you're not personally aware of how many Glock 37s have been manufactured?
I couldn't tell you how many Glocks have been made throughout the world.
Okay. So let's address one of your reports. So in the April 6th report, we're just looking at the firearms, what they are, and what was contained within those firearms, correct?
Correct.
And then on April 16th, you completed another report, and that is the examination of both cartridge casings that have been recovered in this case, correct?
Correct.
And also bullet fragments that have been recovered in this case.
Correct. There were some complete bullets and fragments.
And you would agree that the casings are actually collected from different locations in this case?
Based on the diagram that we previously introduced, they were recovered from the street as well as a vehicle at our Fifth Avenue Forensic Bay.
And are you aware that those were collected on different dates?
I believe they were, but again, I had no personal work in the collection of those.
So you're not aware really of how they were collected?
Correct.
But you would agree that when you're analyzing a shell casing, there's nothing specific about that casing itself that would indicate to you when it had been fired?
Yes and no.
Outside of, let me rephrase, outside of obvious damage such as the 380 in this case, you could tell that that was extremely old, correct?
Well, obvious damage is one thing, and exposure to the elements over a time period can be another thing. So things will begin to tarnish, just like your silver may in your kitchen.
Okay, so you would agree with me that if you had a casing that had been fired 1 day ago and a casing that had been fired 1 month ago, but neither had been exposed to weather, you wouldn't be able to tell which one was necessarily older.
Correct.
Okay, so there's nothing in this case that would have indicated any obvious difference in date between the casings that you examined,
With the exception of that 380.
with the exception of the one that we assume are not related to these firearms, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and let's see. In that report, when you were just examining the casings, you indicated that they were consistent. The 45 gap casings were actually consistent with a number of models of weapons at that stage of your investigation.
Correct.
And that included a Glock 21 model, correct?
Well, no.
No? Okay.
You're referring to the GRC based on the bullet alone. What you just asked about was the cartridge cases. Those are two different items, and that list of potential candidates is based on two different things.
Okay. Okay, I understand. So you're referring to a separate exhibit there. So you would agree that anytime that you are analyzing something here with polygonal rifling, which you indicated on, I believe, Exhibit 25, that is going to be consistent with a group of firearms, correct?
A group of firearms based on polygonal rifling, direction of the rifling, and the ultimate caliber of the firearm.
Because polygonal rifling is completely different than the other rifling you were describing.
It is.
And it is a more narrow class, but it also includes like all Gen 1 through 4 of Glock firearms, correct?
There are polygonal rifling in all generations of Glock firearms. The Gen 5s have a slightly different variation. And I don't think the Glock 37 was made in Gen 5. I'm not even sure that it was made in a Gen 4. I'd have to go back through some reference material.
Okay, but the recovered projectile that we're talking about here just indicated polygonal rifling, right?
It's polygonal rifling that I would expect to see in the Generation 1 through 4 barrels.
Okay, and there's nothing consistent or specific about that one in particular that would link it to this firearm.
Correct.
And you also analyzed a number of fragments that were recovered from the blue Honda Accord, correct?
Correct.
And you indicated those were all consistent with the 30 caliber family, correct?
Correct.
Which is the family of the 7.62 by 39 ammunition.
Correct.
And let's talk a little bit about the differences between just sort of the cartridges for these weapons. So you would agree, bear with me, I'm not an expert like you are, so you would agree with me that the cartridge for a handgun, in this case a 45 gap, is around 200 grains? Am I in the ballpark?
45 gap, when we're talking about spare ammunition, to my knowledge, was produced in 185 grain and 200 grain projectiles.
Okay. And then as opposed to the 7.62 by 39 is a much lighter.
It is. Commonly, the 7.62 is in the 122, 124 grain.
Okay, so the 7.62 is a lighter cartridge, correct?
Correct.
It's going to be ejected faster from a firearm.
Not necessarily. The ejection process would be determined based on how the firearm is designed to function.
Okay, was the firearm that you evaluated in this case functional?
Yes.
And would you agree that the 7.62 rounds would have been ejected at a faster speed than the 45 rounds in this case?
Let me ask a clarifying question.
Okay.
Are you talking about the cartridge case ejection, or are you talking about the projectile firing?
Projectile, the projectile.
Okay, when you say ejection, I'm only referring to the cartridge case. So we're talking about ballistic velocity coming out of the bore. The bore is, their velocity is a relationship of the cartridge design, the projectile. So typically your 45 caliber firearms, going with 45 auto, 45 gap, because gap was created to compete with 45 auto. It's in the 850 to maybe upwards of 1,100 feet per second for muzzle velocity. So that's the velocity of the projectile as it exits the bore. The 7.62 is a rifle caliber. It was designed around a rifle platform. And when you shorten the barrel, that velocity drops. But even with that velocity drop, it is going to be exiting the bore of a particular firearm faster than the 45 would be.
So you would agree that the 7.62 rounds are lighter, correct?
Correct.
And they are faster in this case.
Correct, muzzle velocity.
Okay, and they're going to be more likely to have a greater impact.
No, not necessarily.
Do you have an opinion as to if 7.62 casings are more likely to fragment on their impact?
Casings, no.
Cartridges, projectiles.
Depends on the substrate that they hit. So I can't say that they would or would not.
You don't have an opinion?
I can't, it would depend on the substrate.
Sure. And if we could go to, just refer to some of the photographs that you were shown, would you mind if I borrowed, I can use the paper exhibits if that's fine. So I think that you were asked a few questions about some images of firearms in this case that you reviewed.
Correct.
And were you allowed to review those in advance of your testimony here today?
Yes.
Did you review those with the District Attorney General's office?
We have conversed via text, via email, and this has been over a significant time period.
Sure. Could I approach the witness for
You may.
these? Sergeant Dalton, I just want to go through a few of these images here and just make sure that I understand your testimony. So we looked at a few images here, and you said that you felt, for instance, in this image, that after watching the video and reviewing it, you felt it could be consistent with some of the weapons that we're addressing in this case.
No, it's not that it could be. It is absolutely consistent
You feel
with
that-
recovered firearms.
That the rifle in this individual's hand is consistent with the,
It's consistent. As we received them, we had them flipped, the upper and lower. The
Right.
barrel portion is different than this photograph.
okay. And I would also like to look to some of the photographs that you were shown. You noted in, I believe, this firearm, or this photograph, that you had a hard time identifying either of those weapons with any specificity, correct?
It's very difficult because of the angle that we're looking at. They are similar and consistent if you took only a view of our recovered firearms, but that's as far as I can go with it.
Sure. And you would agree that there's no obvious identifying marks in these photographs?
Correct.
And you would also agree that you said this was consistent with a Glock firearm?
It's consistent in shape with what I would expect from a muzzle view.
And we agree that there are a large number of Glock firearms?
There are,
It's an extremely popular firearm.
yes.
And as to this photograph here, you indicated that you recognize this site as being consistent with the one that we've talked about in this case.
Correct.
And we agreed that that site is an aftermarket site, correct?
Correct.
You'd agree that these can be purchased on Amazon?
We purchased in numerous locations.
Sure. And a lot of handguns, they are interchangeable. They would fit on any that have that Picatinny rim, correct?
Correct.
And then in this photograph specifically, you indicated the individual has a firearm in their waistband, and really all you can say is that that's consistent with a handgun.
It's consistent with what I would see as the shape of the back end of the Glock pistol grip. The grip angle looks to be consistent, and the general rough rectangular shape of the back of the Glock slide.
Sure, and consistent, but nothing specifically identifiable about this.
Correct.
You agree that really only the handle is showing in this?
Correct.
Sure. And same here, we can see that we have a firearm that may be a Glock and it has a laser sight, but again, there's nothing specific or individual about this photograph that would identify.
This one is much clearer on the muzzle view, so I would lean more toward this being a Glock firearm based on that view, just because it's very pronounced.
Sure, and we agree that Glock firearms, again, are extremely, extremely popular.
Correct.
And let's see, let's go and talk a little bit about the casings at issue that you evaluated. So as we noted before, you received shell casings from a number of locations in this case, correct?
From 2 locations that I'm aware of.
And you would agree that some of the 45 gap casings that we're referring to were recovered at Tarleton Avenue.
Correct.
And then it's your understanding that 2 were recovered from an Altima at a later date, correct?
Correct.
And again, we don't really have any way of indicating exactly what date those were fired, correct?
Correct.
And even if you can say that these are consistent with this firearm, you cannot say who would have fired those in that date, correct?
Correct.
If you could give me just a moment here. I don't think I have anything further.
Redirect.
I think everybody's getting hungry, so I'm going to be brief. The 11 spent shell casings that you identified as coming from a Glock 45 caliber gap pistol were all fired from the same pistol,
Correct. Fired from the recovered Glock Model 37.
from that which we recovered.
Yes.
And the spent 7.62 shell casings were all fired from the same weapon, that weapon which we recovered.
Correct.
And the bullet fragments, because they are fragments, you can only establish that they are in the same class and have the same characteristics because of the damage to those particular projectiles.
With the exception of one. One of the 30 caliber projectiles was identified as being fired through the bore of this particular 7.62 firearm.
Thank you.
Mr. Robinette?
I don't have anything,
Mr. Mathis?
That was the 7.62 firearm that we recovered.
Correct.
Thank you, Sergeant. Have a good afternoon.
Yes, sir.
All right, folks, that takes us to lunch. And once again, do not discuss this case among yourselves. You can leave notes in chairs, go to the officers. Have a good lunch, folks. All right, let's say 1:20. 1:20. Have a good lunch, everybody.
Is there, we have an objection?
Thanks, sir.